On April 1st, 1984, at exactly 12:38 p.m., Marvin Gaye walked into his childhood bedroom and sat on the same bed where he had once hidden from his father's belt. The room hadn't changed much in 30 years. The same faded wallpaper, the same creaking floorboards, the same suffocating silence that followed his father's rages. What Marvin couldn't know was that he had less than 12 hours left to live, and that in those final hours, he would speak words that sounded less like conversation and more like a man giving permission for his own death. The decision to move back into 2101 South Gramercy Place had baffled everyone who knew Marvin. Friends, family members, even his own children questioned why a 44-year-old man would voluntarily return to the house where he had been beaten, humiliated, and psychologically destroyed as a child. But Marvin's reasoning, if it could be called that, wasn't based on logic. It was based on exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that made the idea of finding his own place, of starting over again, seem impossible. The house itself stood like a monument to dysfunction. A modest two-story home in a working-class Los Angeles neighborhood, it looked ordinary from the outside. But those walls contained decades of screaming, violence, and terror. Marvin Gaye Sr. still lived there, still preached his twisted version of Christianity, still carried the same rage that had shaped his son's childhood. And at 70 years old, he was still dangerous. When Marvin knocked on that door in December 1983, he wasn't the confident performer who had once commanded stages across America. He was broke, addicted to cocaine, paranoid about government surveillance, and mentally fragile. The IRS had seized most of his assets. His marriage to Janice Hunter had collapsed into bitter litigation. His relationships with his children were strained beyond repair. He had nowhere else to go. His father's house, the place of his deepest trauma, had become his only refuge. The reunion between father and son was not emotional. There were no tears, no apologies, no acknowledgement of the decades of abuse that had passed between them. Marvin Sr. simply looked at his son and said, "You can stay in your old room." Marvin nodded and walked upstairs, carrying a single suitcase and the weight of a lifetime's worth of unresolved pain. What followed were 4 months of psychological tension that everyone in the house could feel. The very air seemed thick with unresolved trauma, decades of pain pressing down on the modest rooms like a physical weight. Marvin's mother, Alberta, tried to maintain peace, cooking for both men, mediating their increasingly frequent arguments. She would hover in doorways, watching her husband and son circle each other like wounded animals, neither willing to back down, neither capable of forgiveness. Alberta had lived through 30 years of her husband's rage, had watched him destroy their son's childhood with systematic cruelty. Now she was watching history repeat itself, but this time both men were adults, both carrying guns in their emotional holsters. She could see the end approaching like a slow-motion car crash, inevitable and horrifying. The house itself seemed to remember every moment of violence it had witnessed. Floorboards creaked under the weight of old arguments. Walls held the echo of childhood screams. In the kitchen where Alberta had once doctored Marvin's cuts and bruises after his father's beatings, she now found herself preparing meals that often went untouched because neither man could bear to sit at the same table. But she was fighting a losing battle. Two damaged men, locked in the same space where one had tormented the other, were never going to coexist peacefully. The house had its own rhythm of dysfunction. Marvin would stay in his room for days at a time, emerging only to use the bathroom or grab something to eat. His cocaine use intensified during this period, and he became increasingly paranoid, convinced that the FBI was monitoring him, that his phone was tapped, that people were following him. He would pace his bedroom for hours, muttering to himself, occasionally shouting at invisible enemies. The paranoia manifested in disturbing ways. Marvin would stand at his bedroom window for hours, watching the street through a crack in the curtains, convinced that unmarked cars were conducting surveillance. He started leaving the house through the back door, taking circuitous routes when he did venture out, constantly looking over his shoulder. Once Alberta found him in the basement at 3 in the morning, dismantling the telephone with a screwdriver because he was certain listening devices had been planted inside it. His physical deterioration was equally alarming. The man who had once been known for his meticulous grooming and stylish appearance now went days without bathing. His clothes hung loose on his shrinking frame. His eyes, once bright with creative fire, had become dull and hollow, darting constantly around rooms as if expecting attack from unseen enemies. But perhaps most disturbing were the conversations Marvin had with himself. Alberta would sometimes pause outside his door and hear two distinct voices, both Marvin's but speaking to each other in different tones. One voice would be pleading, desperate, begging for peace. The other would be harsh, accusatory, listing failures and disappointments in excruciating detail. These internal dialogues could last for hours, growing more intense as the night wore on. Meanwhile, Marvin Sr. continued his routine of morning prayers and evening sermons, acting as if his son's presence was merely a temporary inconvenience. But those who knew him could see the anger building. The old man resented having his authority challenged in his own home. He resented Marvin's drug use, his erratic behavior, his refusal to attend church services. Most of all, he resented that his son, despite all his failures, was still more famous and accomplished than he would ever be. The first serious argument happened in January 1984. Marvin had been playing music loudly in his room late at night, and his father demanded he turn it down. When Marvin refused, Marvin Sr. went upstairs and the two men faced each other for the first time in months. What they said to each other that night remains unknown, but neighbors reported hearing shouting that lasted for over an hour. The next morning, Alberta found a hole punched in the wall outside Marvin's room. Neither man would explain what had happened. As winter turned to spring, the tension in the house became unbearable. Marvin's behavior grew more erratic. He would disappear for days without explanation, returning disheveled and paranoid. He stopped taking care of his personal hygiene. He lost weight at an alarming rate. Friends who visited described a man who looked 20 years older than his actual age, hollow-eyed and gaunt, speaking in whispers about conspiracies and threats that seemed to exist only in his mind. But perhaps the most disturbing change was in how Marvin began talking about his father. Instead of avoiding the subject as he had for most of his adult life, Marvin started bringing up their relationship in conversations with friends and family members. He would describe the beatings he had received as a child in graphic detail. He would talk about his father's hypocrisy, preaching love while practicing cruelty, and increasingly he began making statements that worried everyone who heard them. "He's been trying to kill me my whole life," Marvin told his brother Frankie during one late-night phone call. "Maybe it's time he finished the job." When Frankie asked what he meant, Marvin's response was chilling. "I'm tired, man. I'm tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of pretending everything's okay. If he wants to kill me, let him kill me. At least then it would be over." These weren't idle threats or attention-seeking behaviors. People who knew Marvin understood that he was in the grip of something much darker than depression. He seemed to be actively courting confrontation with his father, as if he was testing the boundaries of the old man's rage, seeing how far he could push before something snapped. The pattern of provocation became more obvious as the weeks passed. Marvin would play music at volumes he knew his father couldn't tolerate. He would make sarcastic comments about religion, knowing it would infuriate the devout older man. He would bring up painful memories from their shared past, forcing conversations about subjects his father preferred to ignore. It was as if Marvin was deliberately trying to recreate the conditions that had made his childhood so unbearable, but this time as an adult who could fight back. On March 30th, 1984, just 2 days before his death, Marvin had a conversation with his cousin that would haunt everyone who heard about it later. She had called to check on him, worried about reports of his declining mental health. During their talk, Marvin spoke about his father with a mixture of hatred and resignation that was disturbing to hear. "He never loved me," Marvin said, his voice barely above a whisper. "All those years, all those beatings, he was trying to kill the part of me that wanted to create, that wanted to be more than what he was. But you know what? He was right. I am worthless. I am everything he said I was." His cousin tried to argue, to remind him of his achievements, his music, the joy he had brought to millions of people. But Marvin cut her off. "None of that matters. At the end of the day, I'm still that scared little boy hiding in the closet, waiting for him to come home drunk and angry. I'm still waiting for him to finish what he started. The conversation ended with Marvin saying something that would replay in his cousin's mind for years afterward. If you don't hear from me again, you'll know why. April 1st, 1984, began like most days in the Gaye household. Marvin stayed in his room until late morning, then emerged to have a brief, tense breakfast with his parents. But something was different about his demeanor. Instead of the withdrawn, paranoid behavior that had characterized recent months, Marvin seemed almost energetic. He was talking more, moving around the house more, engaging with his parents in a way he hadn't in weeks. Alberta later said she thought her son was finally getting better, that maybe the worst of his depression had passed, but those who understood the psychology of suicidal behavior might have recognized the signs. Marvin wasn't getting better. He was experiencing the strange calm that sometimes comes when a person has made a final decision about their fate. Around noon, an argument started over something trivial. Alberta had misplaced some business documents that Marvin needed, and he became agitated. But instead of retreating to his room as he usually did when upset, Marvin began shouting at his mother in a way that brought Marvin Sr. running downstairs. The old man appeared at the top of the stairs, his face already darkening with familiar rage. He descended slowly, each step deliberate, his presence filling the room with the same menacing authority that had terrorized his children decades earlier. Alberta backed away, recognizing the signs of an approaching storm. "Don't you talk to your mother that way," the older man demanded, his voice carrying the same authority that had terrorized Marvin as a child. But there was something different in his tone now, a tremor that might have been age or might have been anticipation. Marvin turned slowly to face his father, and for the first time in months, his eyes were clear, focused, almost peaceful. The paranoid darting was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. "Or what?" Marvin asked, his voice calm but loaded with challenge. The question hung in the air like smoke. "What are you going to do to me, old man? Beat me like you did when I was 7? Lock me in the closet for hours? Tell me how worthless I am?" But this time, instead of backing down, Marvin turned to face his father directly. What happened next was the confrontation that had been building for 4 months, for 4 decades, for an entire lifetime. The words hung in the air like a threat. Marvin Sr.'s face darkened with rage, but he didn't move. For a moment, the two men stood there, father and son, abuser and victim, locked in a stare that contained years of hatred and pain. Then Marvin spoke the words that would be his death sentence. "You know what? You've been wanting to kill me since the day I was born. If you've got the guts to do it now. Otherwise, leave me alone." What Marvin didn't know was that his father had a gun, a .38 caliber pistol that he kept for protection, loaded and accessible. In the heat of rage facing the son who had always been his greatest disappointment and his deepest shame, Marvin Sr. made a decision that would end 2 lives simultaneously. The first shot hit Marvin in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him falling toward the hallway. But he didn't die immediately. He looked up at his father, blood spreading across his chest, and his last words were not a plea for mercy or an expression of regret. They were a statement of recognition. "I knew you would do it eventually." The second shot was fired point blank into Marvin's chest, killing him instantly. It was 12:38 p.m. on April 1st, 1984, one day before Marvin's 45th birthday. The man who had given the world "What's Going On? Let's Get It On" in sexual healing was dead on the floor of his childhood home, killed by the father who had never stopped seeing him as a disappointment. Marvin Sr. was arrested and eventually pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter. He served 5 years in prison before dying of natural causes. But the question that haunted everyone who knew both men was whether Marvin's death was really murder or if it was something more complex. Had Marvin deliberately provoked his father, knowing what the outcome would be? Had he orchestrated his own death by goading a violent man past his breaking point? The evidence suggests that Marvin, in his final months, was not trying to rebuild his life, but was systematically destroying what remained of it. He had isolated himself from friends who might have helped him. He had returned to the source of his childhood trauma. He had engaged in increasingly dangerous behavior, both with drugs and with his father. And in those final moments, he had issued a challenge that no rational person would make to an angry man with a history of violence. Perhaps Marvin Gaye had reached a point where continuing to live seemed more unbearable than dying. Perhaps the weight of his childhood trauma, his failed relationships, his financial problems, and his addiction had created a perfect storm of despair that made death seem like the only escape. Or perhaps, in some twisted way, being killed by his father represented a final victory. Proof that he had been right all along about the man who had tormented him for so many years. Today, more than 40 years after his death, Marvin Gaye's music continues to inspire and comfort millions of people around the world. But for those who understand the circumstances of his final months, every song carries the weight of tragedy. The voice that sang about healing, love, and redemption belonged to a man who never found any of those things for himself. The artist who created some of the most beautiful music in American history died alone on the floor of his childhood home, killed by the man who had been trying to destroy him his entire life. The house on South Gramercy Place still stands, though it has changed hands several times since 1984. New families have moved in, unaware of the tragedy that occurred within those walls. Children play in the same rooms where Marvin once cowered in fear. But sometimes neighbors report, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, you can almost hear the echo of old arguments, the sound of a young man's dreams being crushed by his father's fists, and the final terrible silence that followed two gunshots on an April afternoon. Marvin Gaye had spent his entire life trying to escape his father's house. In the end, it became both his refuge and his tomb. The place where his story began was also where it ended, in violence, in blood, in the final confirmation that some wounds never heal, they only wait for the chance to kill you.